Hello and welcome back to the What the Falk Sunderland preview show. We have fully enjoyed the Championship this season, but our attention does turn to the FA Cup this weekend as we make a lovely visit to London to Old Craven Cottage to face Fulham. As always, we're going to be here to preview the clash and see what's been going on with Fulham since the last time the sides met each other. And I'm delighted to welcome a man who does a million and one things, but for the sake of this podcast is a contributor to the fantastic Fulhamish podcast, Jack Collins. Jack, it's been about 5 years, mate, and things have changed a lot, but how are you? You all right?
I'm very well, thank you, mate. And thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it. It's I'm looking forward to this game, looking forward to having Sunderland back in town. So it's a nice occasion all round, I think.
I was going to say, we'll get straight to it. I was actually quite pleased with the draw. I can't go, sadly, but at the time I was like, Fulham away, class away day. But it's a real test for Sunderland to see how far we've come this season against what is a very good Premier League team. How was the draw seen by Fulham fans, though?
I think in kind of different way. I was excited about this draw, but I wish it was at your gaff. That was the way I was looking at it. I spent 4 very happy years in the northeast of England, and I was looking forward to a visit back to the Stadium of Light. So that was my only kind of caveat. I was like, it would have been nice for it to be an away day, but I think a lot of people will feel the same the other way. I think when you look at this from a kind of Fulham perspective, a lot of people are looking at this and going, wow, we're much further up the Premier League table than we thought we were going to be. We're much closer to safety than we thought we were going to be. And whilst heads are full of dreams of sneaking in 7th place and going on a bit of a European tour or whatever that is, I think that most people are like, hang on, we could have a go at a cup run for the first time in a long time without it contributing. And look, whilst this yo-yo narrative around Fulham has probably been overplayed a little bit in the media, I do think there's an element of when you're either trying to scrap for your lives in the Premier League or trying to go up from the Championship, and you know better than I this year how much of a scrap that is, the relentless nature, the pace of the Championship. There's that kind of element of like, do we have the facilities to go for a cup run? And for so long, the answer has just kind of been no. And I think for the first time, it's kind of opened up. Obviously, you've seen a couple of the big guns knocked out of the FA Cup already. A couple of the others have drawn each other early on. And I think there's a sense around Fulham. It's like, wow, this could be a good year to maybe have a go. We got to the semi-finals in the early 2000s, got to a quarter a little bit after that, but it hasn't been a particularly happy hunting ground for Fulham, since that 1970s trip to the final where we lost to West Ham, which is Fulham's best ever performance. So I think generally it was one of those that's approached with, whoa, Sunderland are playing well. They're a far stronger side than the last time these two sides met. And yet, to get a draw against lower division opposition for this season, at the very least, is always one where you go, hang on, we can win that. And with that caveat that maybe a run could be on the cards, I think it was received pretty well as a draw.
Yeah, I'm quite happy with the draw ourselves, and I can completely understand that viewpoint 100%. And I think, obviously, as I stated before, it's quite exciting for us because it's a really good away day, but Fulham are a very good Premier League team. Now, I've got to be honest, I wasn't sure whether I'd be saying that 6 months ago.
I don't think any of us were, so you're in good company.
Absolutely, mate. I think, Fulham, as you said before, it's maybe been overplayed, and you'll know better than I do, but there's been a few seasons of promotion, a couple of seasons of relegation, and I think people thought the same might happen. But without using a cheesy phrase, you've smashed it so far. Currently sits 7th in the table. From the outside looking in, it's quite hard to understand why it's done well, aside from the fact that Mitrovic is really good, but he was with you last time. So why has it gone so well for Fulham this season?
I think when you look at the last couple of campaigns in both the Championship and the Premiership, obviously we came up through the playoffs the last 2 times that Fulham have been promoted. Once under Aleksandar, where Fulham had made that kind of late steam into the playoffs and felt like we were the team with the momentum. And then under Parker, where we probably weren't the best side in the playoffs. We beat Brentford in that final that didn't have any fans at Wembley. And in a very sort of strange game, a derby without fans in a cup final, it's all like, whoa, this is a lot. And I mean, I don't know if things would have gone the same if there were fans there, the pressure would have been absolutely unbelievable. But you kind of look at those figures and you go, right, those teams needed complete overhauls when they got to the Premier League, because the quality of player in those two sides just wasn't quite good enough to step up. There were a few players who were exceptions to that rule, and I think Mitrovic is probably one of them. Tom Cairney, Tim Ream, fine, doing really well this season. But generally, those players weren't the ones, that Fulham then got to the Premier League and went, oh no, we've got to buy everything. We'll start a team with 9 new players on the first day. And those teams weren't given the time to gel. They didn't gel. We had managerial sackings. We had chaos in the ranks, etc., etc. Second time around, it's a bit different under Parker, but much of the same story, trying to force too much on it at once. Whereas this time when Fulham won the championship, it felt like it was a kind of, right, this is a procession to the title in many ways, but also we've learned how to play against different types of teams. And the turnover this summer was quality rather than quantity. And I genuinely think that's the big difference. Fulham brought in some solid centre-half cover in Issa Diop. They brought in a Premier League goalkeeper who was proven at shot stopping, and while he might not have been the best distributor and had to leave Arsenal for that reason, Bernd Leno was always a good keeper. He just didn't bring what Arteta wanted. And then Joao Palhinha, who's been absolutely different gear through the entire season. He's come in from Sporting. He was a Champions League player. He looks like a Champions League player. And I think you watch him around the pitch, his influence and his kind of physicality in the middle has just changed Fulham from a team that were really, really easy to play through the centre to a team that are really hard to break down and who have the talent in Mitrovic and in Willian, who's kind of revitalised his career. And you could say the same for Andreas Pereira, who left Manchester United. These players have come in hungry, point to prove on the way up, rather than the recruitment of kind of scattergun before. And that overhaul has been far less under Marco Silva. I think that's a major part in why it's kind of carried on from the Championship season to the Premier League one.
It's interesting you mentioned recruitment, because my next question was going to be, is it down to recruitment? But you've answered that, so that's good. That's that one covered. But I think recruitment's massive. I think if you look at Sunderland fans will be listening to us talking about recruitment, and if you remember last time we played each other, the reason we were so much in the shit is because our recruitment was shit and then put on Netflix. Been all right this season, not been too bad, but I think what's most interesting for me, and again, it's probably because we've missed each other the past 5 years. There's a reason we haven't caught up in 5 years. We haven't played each other because we've had very separate seasons, shall we say, for the last half a decade. And Marco Silva, odd manager in many ways. He built up this really glowing reputation with Watford. Then it all went a bit skew-whiff when he went to Hull. Didn't really work out with Everton. I mean, Everton's a different conversation entirely. That's a separate podcast on its own. But what's he brought to Fulham? Why has it been right with him and the marriage being right between Marco Silva, Fulham, and obviously the fans and everything together?
I think there's a couple of factors. And I think one of them is that from kind of early doors, and, I've just spoke about hungry players, looking to restore their reputations. I think Silva has been given that, in a managerial capacity. This is a man who came through at, one of the Portuguese big three, did well, was well desired in England. It fell off. And then he had that break from the end of the Everton season to basically when he took over at Fulham. It's a long period for a young manager especially, to be out of work. So when Fulham came calling, I think it was an opportunity for him to rebuild at a club that were probably going to challenge at the sharp end of the Championship, an opportunity for him to restore his reputation in England. But I also just think he's found a place where he feels relatively happy. And obviously the managerial merry-go-round is in full swing at the moment. And yet there's just not many links to or kind of rumours of Silva leaving. And I think it's down to the fact that he feels supported in a way that maybe previous managers haven't. He came in with a very set kind of philosophy of, this is how I want to do things. I want, say in recruitment, which hadn't happened beforehand, or had happened to a lesser extent, I should probably say. And then, you pair that with the fact that his assistant at Everton and now at Fulham is Louis Beaumorte, who is a Fulham legend, who scored the goal that the last time Fulham beat Chelsea in a league game, which is painfully back in 2006. Thankfully, we've rectified that this season. It's not been a particularly two-sided derby, let's put it that way, for quite some time. And I think there's that immediate link then with the fan base, who was so delighted to see a legend of the club back in the dugout alongside him. He kind of anchors Silva to the club and the fans, which is a really nice kind of element to be in. And then I think, you kind of, this whole thing is just, he is a brilliant attack-minded manager who knows exactly what he wants to do. And there have been some managers, and, Parker, probably the easiest example of this, and it's easy to criticize, and I have been critical of Parker in hindsight. He also scrapped Fulham out of the Championship. Now, whether he should have done better with that team or not is a slightly different question. But he scrapped Fulham out of the Championship with a kind of mentality where like, maybe we'll be able to use this mentality in the Premier League to scrap our way through games, to hold on to things. Turned out that Fulham basically didn't score for an entire season. So that wasn't particularly enjoyable from any of our perspective. Silva came in, revitalised it, scored a club record amount of goals in the Championship, Mitrovic scored the Championship record in terms of goals last season. And he's come into the Premier League and not kind of compromised on those principles, and yet hasn't sent Fulham out in the kind of Jokanovic gung-ho, we'll try and beat you 4-3 if you're Liverpool, which is not the smartest manoeuvre in the entire world philosophy. So Silva's been adaptable, he's been smart, and there's this kind of link between him and the club and the point to prove. I think all of it together has just made for a concoction, a cocktail that has just really worked on the backs of the Thames.
You mentioned Mitrovic there. I did want to mention him because obviously...
Yeah, he has links to the other side of the sea. I appreciate it.
When he was at Newcastle, I think they paid about 12 million, which at the time, big money, but he couldn't hit a Bondo with a banjo, basically. But he's gone to Fulham, scored a ridiculous amount of goals. Maybe a silly question, but is he already a Fulham legend, Mitrovic, for what he's done over the past few seasons?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, he's closing in, not necessarily on the all-time record, but he's closing in terms of where he stands in the Fulham pantheon. And there are some great names in that pantheon. There's some really big names from history. But I think in terms of the modern Fulham era, you have this Silva team at the moment, and you have Roy Hodgson's team that got to the Europa League final. And, you know, the comparisons are being drawn already. Maybe that's a little bit people in the moment giving it large, but that's where the kind of the look is. And you're looking at the Brian McBrides, you're looking at the Clint Dempseys of this world who have their place in Fulham folklore. I think that Mitrovic has pretty much cemented his. And, you know, there's been periods where this hasn't been easy. That Parker season I mentioned, he basically didn't get on the pitch. Parker didn't utilize him as a striker. He said he wasn't the kind of player he wanted. And then you look at what Silva then did with him the next year, and you think, maybe that wasn't the choice that I would have made personally. But, you know, he nearly left. Fulham were looking at bids from him from Russia, from China at times, and big money bids. And yet he's kind of turned it down. He stayed, and he's kind of settled his family within it. And he's another one who probably at the time felt like a bit of a nomad, right? He'd gone to Anderlecht from Partizan. He then went to Newcastle, and then he didn't really get a look in. And he came to Fulham as a kind of broken man in some ways, or at least someone who people were questioning about his place in English football. And then that has obviously continued through the years in terms of, can he do it in the Premier League? I think those questions are finally being put to bed, which is quite nice. But I think in terms of what he's provided in 2 championship seasons and now a Premiership season, there can be no doubt that in the modern Fulham kind of pantheon, he's right up there.
How many did he score last season? I'm sure it was 43 or something like that, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was 43 goals. Yeah.
That's ridiculous.
It's ludicrous. It's silly. It's like, especially, and I think that the funny thing about it was obviously Ivan Toney had scored 31 the season prior, and we were getting it in the neck from Brentford about the fact that Ivan Toney was the guy. And then Mitrovic smashed his record in January, and then went on to score, 43. And you're going, all right, it's gone a little bit quieter over there in Hounslow, which is quite nice to. It's always nice to just quieten things down a little bit. But yeah, it's a ludicrous amount of goals. And at times he was just unplayable. And I think this season at times he's been unplayable too. But obviously the quality has gone up. There have been games where he's not been the man he expected. There have been games where he's been injured, where he's been suspended, although he still's never had a red card for Fulham, which is one of my favourite stats, considering he's considered the hothead. But he's a wonderful footballer, and he has that capacity to just make teams really kind of shiver. It's just like you stick the ball up at the back stick, and pretty much any defender in the world is going, oh Jesus, not him, please. Like, he's just like this big ball of muscle that launches himself at everything, and it's terrifying, I imagine, if you're a defender.
He seems like the kind of player that would just like chuck his head at a brick wall if he needs to, which is not 100%. The safest thing to do. Don't try that at home. But slight negative. You come in on the back of the game at the weekend, on the back of 2-1-0 defeats. It is against Spurs and the other team from the Northeast who are playing quite well. Is there any concern from a Fulham perspective over those games, or is it a case of quality opposition? Unfortunately, it's just ended up on the wrong side of a 1-0 defeat.
Yeah, I mean, look, sadly, the only team that have actually fully put us to the sword this season were that other side from the Northeast, and that was in the home game. But we probably should have got a point up at their space. We probably should have got a point out of the Spurs game. Fulham have had a horrible habit of dropping points in the last minutes to teams in the top 6 of the Premier League table. In fact, I think it's 0 points from all the games that we've played against anyone above us in the table this season. The good news is that it's been a really good return from pretty much everything else. And so when you're looking at that, you're going, well, obviously that's an area to improve in, but if they're the only games that we're really losing and kind of we're competitive in all of them, it's fine. I think there was a bit of the only thing that concerns me. I mean, I think that there are plenty of players in this Sunderland squad who can cause Fulham problems. And I think that considering it's a cup game and the fact that, there's kind of, I think both teams are at a point where, please correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a bit like, well, the season could have a cup run. That's where we're at. It's kind of like a cup run could do both sides of the world a good. I think both sides would love a cup run this season. And that's where we're kind of at with it. So there's always that kind of danger. And there's always the danger of a side in good form from a division below. And we know because we've been that side coming and causing an upset. But I think when you kind of look at it and you go, Fulham played against Spurs, we looked a bit emotionally drained. And I wonder if that's the kind of double from obviously beating Chelsea for the first time in so many years at the Cottage, and then going straight up, playing really well at St James's Park and then losing in the last minute. And I wonder if there's just a little bit of kind of emotional hangover from those. But generally, I haven't been hugely worried about our performances or results against the top 6 thus far.
Yeah, I agree on the wanting to get a point against Spurs. I watched the majority of that game, and I do agree with you on that, actually. You talked about the West London derby, obviously, against Chelsea. It was only a couple of weeks ago, but it's coming back again the week after, I think.
Yeah.
With that in mind, are we likely to see a full-strength Fulham on Saturday, or do you think there's a potential to rest players with such a big game in mind? Because evidently you need to keep a few points ahead of Chelsea, which I didn't think I'd be saying at this point in the season, but I might as well say it to make sure that you've got a nice smile on your face there.
Aye, so we'll be getting a nosebleed if we get any higher in this table. I'll give you that for free. I think there will be rotation. I don't think it's necessarily in terms of players resting. I think there's a couple of players banging on the door on the sidelines. And, that game, as you talked about, Carlos Vinicius came in for Mitrovic, who was suspended, scored the winner. That was his first real moment in a Fulham shirt. And obviously then Mitrovic comes back in because he's the main man, he's the number 9, he's the talisman. And so you kind of keep him on the pitch as much as you can. So I would wager that Carlos Vinicius gets a go in the FA Cup, just because you kind of want to get him on a little bit of a run of competitive football after such a high in that Chelsea game. And so I think he comes in. It doesn't really change the style that Fulham play because he is a Mitrovic light in so many ways. He is going to win those aerial duels. He will look to bring others into play. I think Manor Solomon, who was signed in the summer from Shakhtar Donetsk, is a player that we were really excited about, took a big injury hit straight away. And the same for Harry Wilson, who was so good last year. Those two, I'd imagine, will probably start either side. They haven't been given the minutes really because everyone else has been playing so well. But I think that we've been looking at them in late on in games to kind of try and make a difference recently. And the kind of match sharpness that's lacking is a little bit obvious. So I would imagine those two get a game, and the midfield engine room looks a wee bit knackered at the moment. So I wonder if he gives a bit of a breather to either Paulinho or Reed and brings in Nat Chalobah or someone like that. But generally, I wouldn't say it's going to be a heavily rotated side. I think there will be 4 or 5 changes, but they aren't changes to be like, oh, this isn't full strength Fulham. They are very much changes to be like, right, let's get the squad players minutes so that they can start making impacts in games.
We're doing really well this season. We're very happy. Yeah. I'm actually really enjoying supporting Sunderland for the first time in about a decade. I know you watch an awful lot of football, so I trust you've seen Sunderland more than most. What have you made of our return to the Championship?
It's been very impressive, hasn't it? And I think that anyone who's saying otherwise is either a Newcastle fan or perhaps potentially a Borough one after the weekend. But, you're looking at this and going, right, that's a side that have, in many ways, we've yo-yoed up and down. You've had those moments as well, right? In terms of getting back and forth to the Championship and ultimately looking at that Premier League return. It is one of those where it finally feels, I think from at least my perspective and from watching far fewer games than you guys and everyone listening, I'd imagine, that the squad finally feels like it has some balance and it's not completely and utterly thrown together with like odd bods from here and there who are being forced into different positions. And I think obviously you look at how it's kind of panned out and, Tony Mowbray, I imagine, was brought in, and it was kind of like, oh, not sure what's going to go on here, but he seems to have just found a nice rhythm with this side. And actually, you look at quite a lot of these players, I think, and obviously I have particular interest in Patrick Roberts, who is probably my favorite youth player I've ever seen at Fulham. I was absolutely 100% convinced that Patrick Roberts was going to the absolute top of the game. I was just really hoping he'd declare for Ireland. But it was, Patrick, I think it's Patrick, Michael, Anthony, Declan, Roberts. I was like, he's got to be one of ours.
That's definitely an Irish name. Definitely exactly. An Irish name.
So I was hoping for that eventually. But I think you look at that, and obviously it wasn't the easiest introduction for him when he came, but he feels like he's getting somewhere with it. Amad Diallo obviously has had a very, very impressive season thus far. And I think when you're looking at these kind of players, I remember, watching the Sunderland kind of additions. And I think it was that season where Roberts was there and Jack Clark was there and Alex Pritchard was there. And I was like, that's a very good sort of three behind the striker. You're looking at that and going, those are three players who were considered, mid-table Premier League quality not that long ago. And to build a squad around that kind of attacking unit is a really sensible maneuver. Now, obviously the balance was out and all the different things, but I do think when you look at, the goal scoring record that the Ross Stewart's had, obviously both in League One and has carried that into the Championship, it just feels like he's brought maybe a little bit more, I don't know, it's hard to say, but kind of charisma is the wrong word, but magnetism maybe to that front line, and allowed those players around him to actually get the ball down and actually do what they do best. So I mean, I think when you're looking at this side and you're going, right, there is far more about it that I kind of like and see what's going on. I can see what the game plans are. I can see what Sunderland are trying to do. And I think we saw that, obviously in the derby against Middlesbrough at the weekend. It was very much, I was talking to one of my friends who's a Borough fan, and he was like, it's annoying. And he was like, I thought the penalty in the red card might have been a wee bit harsh, but there's no way that we deserve to win the game. And I think that's about as good as it looks. And that's a Borough side that have looked really good in recent times under Michael Carrick. So I think when you're looking at those kind of games and looking at the team that's been put together by Mowbray, there's plenty of here that I look at and go, right, this is a side that knows how to cause problems to teams. This is a side that if you let these wide players get the ball down and play, they're going to cause your fullbacks problems. And the goal scoring form that Stuart's in, I don't think there's any doubt that he can score goals at pretty much any level. So I do think there's plenty there to trouble Fulham if the whole thing isn't completely correct on Saturday.
I did want to ask you about Patrick Roberts, because obviously I think it was about 14 million he went for at the time. It was a decent whack of cash for I think he was 12 at the time, potentially. He had obviously a great time at Celtic. I think everyone knew he had two very good loan spells here. Obviously, when I got to see him up close, and I thought, well, he'll either go there on a permanent deal or he'll go somewhere else and do really well. And it turned into a total, like you say, he was nomadic for ages. And when he came to us last January, I think the reputation was like, oh, Patrick's, got this potential, but why is he being at Twire? Why is he being at Middlesbrough? Why is he being at Derby? Why is he being everywhere? Never really stuck. And the hope was that he'd find a home and he'd do well. 6 months later, he scores in the last minute to send us to Wembley against Sheffield Wednesday. But then in the summer, in the start of the season, couldn't really get in the team under Alex Neil. Gradually, he's got back into it and now has become one of our best players. And obviously, his pass for Stewart's run through that won the penalty, which was definitely a penalty.
I agree with you for what it's worth, but I was placating a pal.
I'm biased. But he's doing really, really well. And I think probably from a perspective of someone who watched him from a very young age, because I'll come on to one of our youth products in a moment that's got a link with Fulham as well. But how pleased are you for Patrick that he's kind of finding a home and finding his form, and he's looking to me every better player that could, if we were to get promoted at any point in the next couple of years, could handle himself without any problem.
Yeah, I mean, I'm absolutely over the moon. I remember going to see the Fulham youth team that had him in it with Moussa Dembele, who's obviously a Lyon now and is touted to Manchester United every time there's a transfer window. But they terrorized teams. Dembele was just a goal scoring machine, but every bit of magic in the side was Roberts. And it was one of those where you were watching the Fulham team and you're going, get Patrick the ball. And he was a year younger than so many others and playing in the 18s and 21s and going, yeah, this kid's a star. He's a superstar. And his kind of low center of gravity, obviously he was given that kind of Messi tag early on, which is always seems like a harbinger of doom for any sort of player that gets it. But there were those similarities. And I mean, I don't mean that in terms of the quality of player, but in terms of their style, that low balance, that ability to shift through impossible gaps. You could see exactly why those comparisons were being made. And obviously he went to Man City. And to be honest, at the time, I was relatively delighted for him. I was like, that's a big move. And he's going to a place where they have nurtured young talent. They have found academy pathways, not often, sure, but those players who have shone have been given their opportunities in the likes of Phil Foden, Rico Lewis, et cetera, et cetera. He went off to Celtic then, and he looked every inch the player that I was like, right, there he is. And I remember him playing the Champions League. I believe he scored against City when he was on loan for them. And you're going, right, he's back, and he obviously linked back up with Dembele at Celtic as well. I was like, right, that's a partnership. That was split up. And I do think that there was an element there when he left Celtic, and they did try to bring him back, I believe, that he was like, I don't know what to do next. And City kind of farmed him out to a couple of the clubs, as you say, the Troyes loan fell through. I think he went to Girona as well. And all of those City Football Group clubs that kind of act as feeders and want to bring through their own talent. I don't think he settled anywhere really. And so then it became, oh God, this is Patrick Roberts' last chance. He's on loan at Norwich. He's on loan at Derby. You're going, what's going on here? Why can't he find somewhere? So I'm delighted to see him feel comfortable again, because I think when he's in that mind space, when he's in that kind of place where he's happy, he's just one of those players that's pure joy to watch. And I think we all need them every so often, don't we?
I absolutely love Patrick Roberts, not as much as my fiance, but he's a good looking boy, so I'll let him off. In reference to, I was saying before about the transfer window, and I always like to have a look at the headlines and what's going on. And the only kind of one that was really interesting was something that popped up 6 days ago. So you can update me on this, but from a Sunderland perspective, obviously has been a while since we faced each other. But you've also been linked with a striker that you've already had. That is one of our former players. That was probably one of the only good players that has actually done that well for us in League One up until last season. Josh Maja. He's obviously on loan. He scored twice, I think, at Everton. Didn't really do much out of that. But he's been linked with a 4 to 6 million move to Fulham. How highly do the Fulham fans rate him? Because we really liked him, but obviously it was in League One. We didn't get to see him in the Premier League or anything else. Is that a good move? Is that something that's going to happen?
I think generally the response to that rumor has been relatively negative from Fulham fans. And I don't necessarily think that's because anyone thinks that Maja is a bad player. He's a strange one because obviously he came through at Fulham or very young and then went to Sunderland and then came back. And it was like, he was kind of heralded as a savior figure by Parker whilst he was still ostracizing Mitrovic from the team. And so therefore there was this kind of internal debate that probably didn't exist within the club, but existed within the fan base of people being like, oh no, Josh Maja is actually the answer, not Mitrovic. And then these kind of old school kind of view of, no, Mitrovic should be playing. And it all kind of went a bit wrong. I thought Maja did all right for us, to be perfectly honest with you. In a side that didn't score many goals, I think he got sort of 1 in 3 when he was playing in the Premier League with us. In a side, and under Parker, where Fulham created very, very little, he didn't miss much. That's like my overarching memory. He had one chalked off, I remember. I think it would have been better, but he had a goal chalked off that actually changed the VAR ruling on handballs afterwards. And it was like, okay, that probably should have stood. So personally, I quite like Maja, but equally, I'm a bit like, if Fulham are playing a very obvious style under Marco Silva, Carlos Vinicius being the backup to Mitrovic because he's basically the same player in a light version so that Fulham don't have to alter styles should something happen to Mitrovic. I just don't think it makes huge amounts of sense right now, but I don't think that that's any sort of slight on Maja as a player because I quite like him.
Yeah, and to be fair, he didn't miss much for us in the 6 months he kind of played, but very different level. But he always looked at that player that could step up. But I did find the link a bit weird. My initial reaction when I read it was, did they need him?
Yeah.
And
no, probably not.
No, not for me. If you want to come back to Sunderland, though, we do need a striker to back up Ross Stewart. He's more than welcome back if you want to realise his mistake of leaving.
I'd be delighted to see it.
It wasn't really his fault, bless him. We've all watched Netflix, haven't we? My predictions are terrible, so I don't know why I'm even bothering because it pretty much shows how much I know absolutely sweet FA about football, but I'll do it anyway. I think we'll perform well and get nicked 2-1 and it'll be 1-1 to late on. And then, of course, Mitrovic, because of his connections, we'll score late on and we'll go, oh, well, that was a shame, but that was a nice day out. And then everyone will go out and get drunk in and around Putney Bridge. And that's my whole prediction for the day, which I didn't expect to give. But you don't need to give me a prediction for the day, Jack, but what would be your prediction for Saturday?
I was going to go 2-1 as well. I think that it will be tight, and I just think that it will be the subs off the bench that maybe actually make those differences. I think Harry Wilson's got a point to prove. I think Manor Solomon has a point to prove, and I think that if those two get the nod, then they might just kind of spark Fulham into life. So I'm going to say 2-1 Fulham. And my prediction for the day, though, I will give you one. Yes. I get to sit in our new stand for the first time because I sit in the Hammersmith End, so my season ticket is. But all the tickets for this game were at the same price wherever you sit. And the new stands are normally well expensive because of like plushy seats and stuff. But they were all the same price. So I was like, wicked, I'm going to go sit in the new stand. So I'm excited to actually see what the hospitality of Craven Cottage is like at the new bit and have a little gander around the new stand. So that should be exciting.
I've always wanted to go in the neutral end.
Most people in there will probably be Sunderland fans at the weekend because I think, when you get those kind of ones, it's a strange on the neutral end because it doesn't really exist anymore. Since they did the stand extension, they moved a load of season ticket holders in there who used to be in the Riverside stand. So it kind of moved about. And the reason it was a neutral end to begin with is because there's a FA ruling that you can't have two different sets of stands using the same turnstiles. And Fulham had no way of segregating that stand in terms of the bit in behind. So that's why it was a thing to get around the fact that Fulham either had to give the whole stand up to away fans or find a way around it. And it was a way round FA red tape. So there you go. Fun story for today. Every
day is a school day. Jack, obviously you do loads of really good stuff. You're an incredibly busy man. Do loads of good stuff for the Athletic, tons of stuff that I listen to. But if people haven't heard your stuff before, where can we find all your good stuff?
Thanks. I'm at Jack J Collins on Twitter. I run I imagine that Fulhamish is not going to be of particular interest to most people, but I do actually run a general football podcast called Ranks FC, where we sort of talk about Europe's big leagues, really, and the Premier League included, just sort of spin our way around Europe and generally have a bit of a laugh. So if anyone fancies a new general football podcast to listen to, we'd love it if you came and give us a listen over at Ranks FC.
Well, I was going to say, we might not listen to the Fulham podcast, but I've really enjoyed the Borough podcast this week, so you never know.
Well, you might enjoy Fulhamish next week, then we'll see.
Yeah, maybe. Jack, really good catching up, mate. I genuinely mean that. It's a shame that it's been so long, but keep up the good work. I'm sure you will. You don't need me to tell you that, but thanks for popping on. It's been a pleasure.
No, thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure and great to catch up with you, mate. It's always a pleasure. I had a great time.
Even better next season when we get promoted.
100%.